It's not every year at Marxism that we have a meeting on is there a dialectic of nature. But I think it is important that we at least try to engage with this question, try to understand a little bit about it. It's not just relevant to our analysis of science and our analysis of the environment. And there's a selection of books on the environment over at the bookstall that people can have a look at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment later on. It's not just relevant to science and environment. It's also partly a much wider question. It's about what kind of a philosophy Marxism is. It's about what it's meant to be used for. It's about what kind of methods that we can use to understand the world around us and the way that world works. So you could say it's about explaining a world in turmoil. It's also about how we intervene in that world. I think Marx says that philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. But I don't think you can separate out interpreting the world from changing it. You change the world by interpreting it, and you interpret it as you change it. They're inseparable. So it's about intervening in the world as well as understanding the world. And in a way, the question of the dialectic of nature links into much wider debates that have been going on probably for thousands of years about philosophy, about idealism, about materialist philosophy. But I'm not going to obviously cover the whole of Western philosophy in the talk. Be pleased to hear. I'm going to start in 1873 and start with Friedrich Engels, and specifically, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do that.
Okay, so while you're doing that, how does that microphone work?
Do you want to swap mics?
Yeah.
This one's much louder. It's a bit. I can show you.
Yeah, is that any better?
Move forward a little bit. I'm a bit closer here. Well, you can move forward.
Yeah.
Is the screen?
Right, so rather than try and cover the whole of Western philosophy, I'm going to start with 1873 and with Friedrich Engels, and specifically with the 30th of May, 1873. This is when Engels writes to his friend and collaborator, of course, Karl Marx, and he says to Marx, this morning while I lay in bed, the following dialectical points about the natural sciences occurred to me. The subject matter of natural science, matter in motion, bodies. Bodies cannot be separated from motion. One cannot say anything about bodies without motion, without relation to other bodies. Only in motion does a body reveal what it is. Natural science, therefore, knows bodies by examining them in their relation to one another and in motion. And he also adds that he thinks that Marx might like to keep quiet about these ideas for a little bit. He says, if you think there's anything in it, don't say anything about it just yet, so that no lousy Englishman may steal it from me. He says it may take a long time yet to get it into shape. And unfortunately for those of us that follow these ideas of Engels and have engaged in some of the debates that have gone on since then, it's unfortunate that Engels never actually got to finish writing the Dialectics of Nature, never got to defend his project or explain what it was really about in full. Some of it was later published in 1939 by Haldane, who was a socialist biologist in Britain. But in the Dialectics of Nature, what Engels is really starting to do is to try to apply the dialectical methods that Marx had developed and was developing and using to write Capital into his own studies, his own quite extensive studies of the natural sciences. I think it's worth going into a bit the kind of context in the 19th century in which Engels was writing. It's also worth noting that Engels was highly educated, widely educated, in fact. Haldane, in the introduction to Dialectics of Nature, the bit of it that was published, called him one of the most widely educated men of his day. He knew about philosophy, about social sciences, about history, of course. Comrades might also be familiar with his engagements with anthropology, but he also studied extensively in physics, chemistry and biology, a little bit of maths, and was in continuous sort of communication with the scientists of the day, and what you see in Dialectics of Nature is him getting involved in these debates with scientists at the time, and in some cases actually contributing quite constructively to those debates. Some of the insights that Engels came up with in Dialectics of Nature have since been sort of proved correct. Some of them are really sort of have been they've been kind of dismissed in the 20th century. They're kind of things that were quite acceptable in the 19th century, but we don't really believe in anymore. But some of them are really quite insightful and really quite interesting, and have kind of pointed out some of the woolly kind of illogical thinking of some of the scientists of the day, and come to quite clear conclusions. It's the context that Engels was working in was really quite a revolutionary time, I think, for science, that part of the 19th century. Joule in Manchester had argued what we now accept, that mechanical energy can convert into heat energy, that heat can convert into chemical energy, etc., etc., that energy is conserved but can transmute into different forms. And Charles Lyell, who's sort of one of the founding fathers of geology, had noted the continual creation and destruction of strata in the rock face. I think most notably Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, which really kind of revolutionises biology, turns biology from a science of collecting different specimens, going around the world, collecting and identifying specimens, towards a science where we can see that species can evolve into radically new forms, can undergo profound transformations. Marx and Engels called Darwin's ideas the evidence in natural history for our view, the sort of evidence that organisms have a history, that they're not just static, that they evolve through time. So there's a lot of changes going on within science in the 19th century. Science is starting to sort of transform, well, in various different sciences. People are starting to look at the processes of transformation that the objects of their sciences go through. What I think probably most people that are familiar with Dialectics of Nature and Engels' ideas remember about it is that it's also where he lays out the three principles of dialectics, which we often refer to at Marxism, and the principles of the interpenetration or unity of opposites, the idea that quantitative change can transform into qualitative change and vice versa, and the negation of the negation. And these are principles that he borrows from the philosophy of the great German philosopher Hegel. And often we use examples that come from science and come from the analysis of the natural world to explain what we mean by these different laws. So one example which comes from Engels himself is the one about how water, when you heat it up to a certain temperature, when you heat it to 100 degrees, it starts off going through a quantitative change, goes through an increase in temperature, but when you get to 100 degrees, as qualitative change, changes form from being a liquid to a gas. There's also the one about the chicken and the egg, which is from George Politzer, a French philosopher. And Politzer argues that when a chick hatches from an egg, it destroys that egg, so you could say that it negates the egg. When the chicken grows up into an adult hen, that hen then negates the chick. And people are kind of giggling because it's really quite a strange way of looking at the world if you think about it, isn't it? That we try and come up with these, there's only three laws, and we try to fit the whole of nature into these three kind of quite obscure sounding laws in the way that they're put. Seems like the natural world around us is a lot more complicated than boiling water to make a cup of tea, or even more complicated than breeding chickens. So there's often this kind of misconception of Marxism and a misconception of dialectics, that we try and take these ideas from the outside. We invent these kind of strange laws, and that we try and force nature to follow these laws. I think it's quite reasonable that lots of people within the Marxist tradition have then used that to criticise the dialectics of nature. And many Marxists from throughout the 20th century, from all kinds of different backgrounds, have questioned, or in some cases completely dismissed, the idea of the dialectics of nature. So I wanted to go into a little bit about some of those criticisms of it, before I then argue that maybe, well, then question whether there is something in the idea of a dialectics of nature, but of course that depends on what we mean by nature and depends also on what we mean by dialectics, I guess. And so I think one of the criticisms of dialectics of nature, for example, is from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist who went through a sort of communist phase when he talked about these things. And he says that the only dialectic that you can find in nature is the one that you've put there yourself. So really kind of pointing out that if you really want to, you can invent a law like the negation of the negation. You can find evidence for it in the natural world. If you look hard enough, and if you're quite selective about the bits of the so-called natural world that you take your examples from, it shouldn't be too hard to find an example of the negation, or to find an example of any other law that you want to make up. It's been called as kind of the yoga of Marxism, trying to squeeze nature into all these kind of weird positions. And that's, I think, quite a good point from Sartre. Actually, there's also people like Alfred Schmidt from the Frankfurt School. He wrote The Concept of Nature in Marx, which is the first sort of early systematic attempt to go through Marxism and look at all the different areas where Marx refers to nature and evaluate Marx's concept of nature. It's a project that's been carried on in later works by the likes of John Bellamy Foster and people like Martin Empson in our own, in the SWP as well, this idea that Marxism does have something to say about nature. Schmidt was one of the early advocates of that, but he also says that Marx doesn't refer to nature in any context apart from when he refers to nature in the way that it relates to society. So he says that Marx didn't have any concept of nature outside of society, and therefore wouldn't have said that dialectics applied to that nature. Might question whether we take Schmidt that seriously. He was quite pessimistic, really, about the prospects for socialism. He sort of thought that even under socialism, we'd still have this problematic relationship with our environment, that even a more equal society would still damage the environment in just the same way that we do under capitalism, really. So quite pessimistic. Also, from what I've heard, I'm not an expert on Schmidt, but he wasn't a great advocate of women's rights either, so maybe not someone that we should take that seriously. But someone that I think we should really take seriously is George Lukács, a Hungarian Leninist Marxist. He famously changed his ideas a lot throughout his life, but I think around the era of from between 1917 and into the early 20s, when he was a Leninist quite clearly, I think, when he engaged with Lenin, when he dealt with all these ideas that we've been talking about at Marxism, about reform or revolution, when he was part of those debates, quite intimately involved in those debates. He was part of the Communist Party. He was went into exile in Vienna because of this crackdown on the Communist Party. I don't have time to go into the whole of Lukács' thought, but it comes out, his idea of dialectics comes out most clearly in his sort of masterwork, History and Class Consciousness, where he says that the dialectic, the materialist dialectic, is a revolutionary dialectic. It's a tool that the working class can use to understand the world around us, but also to try to change that world. He says that the working class are uniquely able to understand the capitalist world in which we live in. We're able to gain class consciousness because of the position that we play under capitalism. I can't really go into the full reasons why he comes to that conclusion, but I think the point is that it's about the working class and how we can gain class consciousness. But the question is, where does that really leave the natural world? Things like trees or rocks or bacteria or any aspect of the natural world, they don't engage in class struggle or reach class consciousness. You don't see the same processes that Lukács identifies in the social world, in the natural world. And he's often assumed that he dismissed the idea of a dialectics of nature entirely. And the reason why we think that is due to a short quote. It's actually, I think, in a footnote in History and Class Consciousness, where he says that the misunderstanding which arises from Engels' presentation of dialectics rests essentially on the fact that Engels, following Hegel's false example, extends the dialectical method also to the knowledge of nature. So he doesn't think that the dialectical method can be extended towards the knowledge of nature. a lot of people assume that that means that Lukács doesn't think that there's any dialectical process within nature. Some people have slightly questioned that. John Rees in Algebra of Revolution, John Rees used to not believe in the dialectic of nature, and then he kind of drifted a bit towards it and was kind of semi-convinced of it. He argues that Lukács isn't necessarily completely rejecting the idea of a dialectic of nature, but he is saying that you need different methods to understand nature from the methods that you use to understand the social world. Because he thinks that the way we understand nature is as a sort of a distanced, objective observer, and the way that we understand the social world is that we can't possibly avoid being part of that world, so we understand it from the inside, whereas we kind of understand nature from the outside. But that's the sort of thinking that I think at this particular point of time we can, I'd slightly critique, and I think Gramsci also critiques it as well. Gramsci says, I don't know if Lukács is right or if Lukács is wrong, but if he creates a dualism between society and nature, then he's wrong. And I think the question for people that reject the idea of the dialectics of nature is, can you really separate out society and nature that clearly? Can you draw a hard and fast line between that's nature over there, that's society over there, and can you say that we need different methods to understand the two of them? I think to sort of talk about dialectics of nature, then we need to have some idea of what this nature is that we're talking about. What do we actually mean by nature? And it's probably just as difficult to deal with as dialectics, and many people find rightly find dialectics quite complicated, but nature is also one of the most contentious words in the English language, as Raymond Williams put it. I think it wouldn't really be possible for me to come up with a definitive definition of what nature is, and I'm not going to try to do that, but I think it's worth kind of questioning some of the implicit, maybe slightly bourgeois, reactionary ideas that we have when we hear the word nature. I think when I hear the word nature, I probably think of a sort of a green field with a tree in it. That's the image that a lot of people have in their mind when they hear the word nature. If you look up nature on Google image search, you get a lot of pictures of waterfalls, green rolling hills, leaves with bits of dewdrops on them, mountains, tropical islands. There's a few sort of snowy Arctic scenes, not very many. A lot of pathways leading off into the distance with no one on them. A lot of benches with no one sat on them as well. That's our idea of nature, apparently. So it's a sort of a paradise view of nature, but it's a nature that doesn't have humans in, that exists beyond the edges of our cities. And this is the kind of idea that people like Neil Smith and other Marxist geographers have sort of critiqued, this idea that you can treat nature as something that doesn't involve humanity, that's separate from us. I think you see these dualistic interpretations in the ideas of people that think that the world's population is growing too fast, for example. They think that nature and society are two separate things that are in opposition to each other, or we must hold back society somehow to stop it encroaching on nature, that they're two separate things that fundamentally opposed to each other. You also see it in sort of technocratic ideas, the idea that we can solve all our environmental problems with ever more sophisticated technology, that we don't need to take nature into account, that we can treat it as an externality, that we can just kind of manage, that we can dominate. So there are dualistic ideas of society and nature that come from people that are sort of trying to protect nature, although they might have slightly strange ideas about how to do it, and people that have no interest in protecting nature alike. Marxists, I think, can have a quite sophisticated critique of this idea that society and nature are separate. Marx himself said that we can't refer to the relationship between humanity and nature. That's kind of saying that nature relates to itself because humanity is part of nature. And Neil Smith has gone further and said that actually we produce a type of nature within the old nature. I think it's the kind of thing that John Bellamy Foster has looked at as well, with his idea of a metabolic rift between society and nature. So really all these kind of, the Marxist ideas are looking not at how we can argue that society and nature relate to each other. It's more about, we start off with society and nature as different aspects of a unity. They're all part of the same thing. But then we look at what the historical processes have been that have caused society and nature to be broken apart, that have meant that we see them as separate things and treat them as separate things. So it's a historical interpretation of the relationship between society and nature. So I think if we've sort of followed Gramsci and criticised the dualism between society and nature, then it makes it much more difficult to argue that there's a dialectic in society, but not a dialectic in nature, I would argue. But then the question becomes, what kind of dialectic might we see in nature? Another thing that I don't really have time to go in detail, people might want to discuss a bit about what they think dialectics is, perhaps. But it does depend on what we think dialectics is and what it might be useful for. I think dialectics shouldn't just be something, a sort of obscure set of rules that we learn in conferences every year and then forget for the rest of the year. It should be something that we can use to interpret the world around us in our everyday lives. And I think the key to that is seeing dialectics as fundamentally a science of change and of contradiction. The most important thing is that it's an analysis of the way the world changes. That bourgeois thinking likes to treat the world as if it's always going to stay the same as it is today. But we need to have an analysis of the way the world actually is changing around us. We all know that it is changing. We need to know in what direction the world's changing and how fast it's changing. So it might seem a bit obscure. Bert Ullman, who's an American philosopher, he likens dialectics as a method to sort of jumping on a moving car. Would you want to jump onto a moving car if you were blindfolded and you didn't know how fast that car was moving and in what direction? You need methods to understand the way that the world is changing. So it's about change and about contradiction. I think David Harvey also kind of reflects on this when he sees dialectics as about seeing the world as a complex of processes. It's not about dividing the world up into separate things. We like to think that we can analyse the world around us by dividing it up and saying that's one thing, that's another, we can treat them all separately. He draws more attention to the totality of the world around us. He says that we need to see the world as complex of processes rather than a series of ready-made things. Engels made a similar point in Ludwig Feuerbach, which is another thing that he was writing after Marx died, which is another reason why he didn't ever get to finish writing about the Dialectics of Nature. I didn't mention that Marx died after he'd started writing the Dialectics of Nature, so he had to go off and edit Capital, but he also wrote this Ludwig Feuerbach, published a thesis on Feuerbach, incredibly important 600 words of Marx. I digress a bit, but Engels, in Ludwig Feuerbach, in the end of classical German philosophy, says that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which things go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. So all that is solid melts into air, really. So that's sort of the way I see dialectics, a sort of form of dialectics that might be applied to nature. People might want to disagree with me. I don't have all the answers on this clearly, but I just wanted to sort of end up with a little bit about how some slightly more recent scientists have interpreted and have used dialectics in their work. I studied biology at university, so I use an example from biology, which isn't to say that there isn't a dialectic in physics or chemistry. It's just really it's both the subject that I'm most familiar with and also the subject that's most famously been treated dialectically. I haven't even mentioned anything about Stalin's treatment of Dialectics of Nature, which I think is also worth engaging with. But, well, not engaging with, but criticising, you know what I mean. So I think the most sort of famous example of scientists that have used dialectics in their work is, of course, Levins and Wantin in The Dialectical Biologist. Interestingly, they didn't choose to call it Dialectics of Biology or Dialectics of Nature. They call it The Dialectical Biologist, as they have kind of incorporated dialectics into their work kind of so much that it's a part of the way they do their work. They're not philosophers trying to apply a set of rules from the outside to nature. They're using it in their work in the way that they carry out their practice. People that are familiar with Levins and Lewontin might know they're both professors at Harvard. They're both still alive, actually. They're emeritus professors. They've been teaching there for decades, really. They still kind of get involved in these debates. There was there's a discussion list called Science for the People on the internet that was talking about Cuban science, and Richard Levin's kind of had his little say in it. So they engage with all these ideas about science in Cuba. They criticise reductionist biology. They criticise the idea that there's a gay gene. All of those kind of things. They're activists as well as biologists, but really the point is, I think one of the most kind of the intriguing aspects of what they discuss in the dialectical biologist is the idea of the way organisms relate to the environment around them. I think we tend to see organisms as just responding to challenges from the environment, just passively responding to what the challenges that their environment puts up around them. And so in sort of classical Darwinism, you get this idea that organisms, whether they're animals or plants, have to respond to a set of challenges that are posed by their environment by evolving. So something like a humpback whale that lives in the cold, icy waters of the Arctic is challenged by that environment, has the challenge of cold water, has the challenge of there being lots of krill to eat that are nutritious. It responds to that by evolving to have lots of blubber and to have a big mouth, to have some really impressive and interesting ways of catching krill. But what Levins and Lewontin have pointed out is that that kind of treats the organism as passive when actually they play an active role in their own evolution as well. Which isn't to say that Darwinism is wrong, but it's to say that Darwinism, that kind of the classic original version of Darwinism, leaves something out of the picture, which is the role that the organism plays in its own evolution. Leaves it as irrelevant, because actually organisms are also capable of transforming the environment around them. So in some ways, the humpback whale also defines for itself which aspects of its environment it sees as relevant. It might see, the coldness of the water as relevant to itself. It might not see other aspects of the environment as relevant. Very small bacteria that are swimming around the whale have no consequence for it, but they would have a consequence for something else that's small. And there's a lot of sort of examples that Levins and Lewontin point out of the way organisms transformed their environment in really quite radical ways. Beavers build dams and block rivers. Plants adapt the soil around their roots in order to make it easier for themselves to absorb nutrients. And plants in particular have transformed the environment on a massive scale. The reason why there's oxygen in the air that we can all breathe is because plants have evolved photosynthesis that allows that to happen. There are numerous examples of the way organisms have reacted back on their environment and changed it. So organisms are in this relationship with the environment, which is also a relationship that develops through time. So going back to this idea that it's about matter in motion, it's about nature having a history. And what I really want to sort of end up on, there are lots of other examples from science that I guess people might want to come to, but I think the implications that this kind of thing has for Marxism is that Marxism is a materialist philosophy. It's not the kind of philosophy, I don't think, where we think that the world around us doesn't exist, or that we think that it's all made up in our heads. Thanks. It's the kind of philosophy that asserts that there is a concretely existing world and that we can gain some knowledge about that world around us. We treat the world as changing, I think, because it is changing. We treat the world as having contradictions because there are contradictions in that world. If we question the distinction between society and nature, and that we agree that there are dialectical processes in society, then that brings into question, where do those dialectical processes come from? Can you really consistently say that there's no dialectic in nature. And just as a sort of a last example of why I think it's important to observe the way that nature really is changing. Recently, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere exceeded 400 parts per million. This is the first time since measurements began in 1958. The levels of the gas in the atmosphere fluctuate, but it's possible they'll soon reach levels where they'll cause irreversible changes. And things like if the Siberian permafrost starts to melt, releases methane into the atmosphere, that will cause a rapid shift in the kind of climate change that we can expect in the future. It's not that the world has never been this warm before. It has been warm in the past, but not when humans have been here. And you can't really understand the way that nature is changing. It's not just climate change as well, species loss, pollution, all these kind of environmental problems still exist. We can't really understand these environmental problems without reference to the human society that have caused these problems, and without reference to the way that they're going to react back on human society. So I think the question is, maybe shouldn't be, is there a dialectic in nature, but what are we missing in the way that we look at the world if we don't see nature in a dialectical way?
I'm happy for everyone to take their own choice on what they eat. I used to be vegetarian, I now eat meat, but I mean, Hitler was a vegetarian, wasn't he? I don't think that reflects on vegetarians in any sense. I think what we should say is that animal research, work on animals, although it seems a shame we have to do this, that has been integral to actually understanding how the body works. And unfortunately, because you can't really just learn things as a dialectician from just looking at a single cell. Actually looking at whole organisms is unfortunately part of the way science has advanced. Anyway, I don't really want to touch upon this topic. Maybe someone else might want to take up this argument more than me. What I wanted to talk about was really how I do think, speaking as a biologist who runs a lab in Oxford, how much dialectics is important in me understanding how the natural world works. Because I think we can get too tied up in these arguments on whether there's a dialectic in nature or whether we see dialectical principles in nature. I think it's probably more the case that there are things, any complex system, I think dialectical principles can make sense of that in a way that a more reductionist strategy, where you sort of think that everything can be explained by looking simply at the kind of base elements, we can learn a lot. And I think this can apply to both society and biology, as the speaker said quite rightly. And I think a very sign of why this is so important is that so many, in areas of science, like looking at the brain or how the embryo works, there are huge problems there in mainstream science understanding how these things work. And it's only this understanding of complex systems that really allows us to I think, go beyond this. And as the speaker says, this is vitally important in terms of the environment, given that there's a sort of sense in which we can just let the CO2 kind of build up and eventually we can just stabilise it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Things like quantity into quality, dialectical principles do mean that you get tipping points, you get certain points you can't reverse, and that is so important to say, given that capitalism is potentially driving us to destruction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the argument, this is not purely an academic argument. There are actually practical consequences to the argument about, and one which I entirely agree with the speaker, that there is a dialectic in nature. Now, I'll give you some examples. Just if you read the newspaper, you'll often hear stories which, John Carrington sometimes comments on the science pages of a socialist worker of, scientists claiming who've done an NMR scans can detect criminal behaviour in the brain patterns of individuals or in genes, that there is a gay gene. Where do these ideas come from? The thing about science is that scientists do actually have a philosophical framework, because science itself evolved from a philosophical framework. The founders of the modern scientific method were people like Francis Bacon, who developed from the philosophy of empiricism, and René Descartes, which developed the theory of philosophical idea of reductionism. So the reductionist idea of the world is that everything is reducible to a set of particles of matter which are suspended in three-dimensional space, and everything can be understood from that. That was the Cartesian reductionist approach. With empiricism, the empiricist approach which Bacon pioneered, which is essential to science, is we need to observe the natural world and record it before we can understand it. The limitations of having a purely empiricist view of the world is you will see the world as not as a totality, but as fragmented bits of reality. So there's no attempt to integrate it or providing a theory which unifies and ties nature together to provide a deeper insight. And of course, with reduction, we see the problems as I've described. What is great about having a dialectical view is it shows us how rich and complex nature is, and doesn't limit it. So, for instance, the concept of what is reality. The thing is, when we study science at school, we study physics, chemistry, biology, but reality isn't reducible to physics, it's not reducible to biology, it's not reducible to chemistry. When biologist studies the natural world, he needs to understand the chemistry, the biology, the physics, and a few other sciences as well. He has to integrate all these insights into the total, which provides a rounded view of nature. And it's the same with climate science.
Could you sum up, please?
Yeah, we can't simply, cherry pick this bit of data or that bit of data, as some climate skeptics do and say, well, because the glacier is actually increasing in this part of the world, that should prove that global warming isn't happening. See, that is
Comrade, could you sum up, please?
A viewpoint which is completely at variance with the dialectical view of nature.
Hi, Justin, Kingston University. Thanks, Camilla. That was really clearly delivered. There's a vague comparison to what you said with the early 20th century development of atomic physics and quantum understanding of the atom, where multiple scientists were working together through dialogue and through argument to sort of come up with something that neither of them would have, in their wildest imaginations, have thought was the answer. But also you have individual genius, Niels Bohr or Einstein, as well as the sort of collective coming together and arguing things through to develop the quantum theory that we have. And I wonder if this can be compared to human relation, or how can science be applied to how we organise ourselves? We have personality, character, and psychology, but what we are talking about is human organisation. So which, as you said, is changing all the time, evolving minds and evolving technology. So I wonder, as it's an evolving process, is it possible for us to come up with a theory, a true and meaningful and permanent theory for how we can organise ourselves in society as human beings, or is it something that will never happen? Will there never be an absolute theory? Will it always be something, a process developing and moving constantly?
Thank you.
There's a really rich Marxist tradition on ecology, and I'm always glad that there's sessions like these. And so even in terms of something as simple as the term ecosystem is a dialectical concept, the idea that you can't analyze an organism in isolation from its environment. You can only see it in terms of its interconnection with the environment, the impact it has on the environment, and the impact the environment has in itself. And Stalin, as part of his forced industrialization, consciously went to completely bury all of the really rich ecology that early socialists had developed, and it's thanks to work by John Mills Bellamy Foster that's helping to revive that. And it has a very practical conclusion. Just as an example, I grew up on the west coast of Canada, and it was a time when these old growth forests were being completely demolished. And it was very divided. So my best friend's dad was a lumber worker, and he hated environmentalists. My ecology teacher was arrested for protesting, and he hated the workers. And none of them cared much about First Nations people. So as a consequence, nothing happened. There was, everybody was totally miserable. Now what's happening is there's a very inspiring indigenous sovereignty movement called I Don't Know More. I don't know if people have heard about it. And the culture and the spirituality and the activism of indigenous people very much connects with the ideas that Marx first developed, because their entire societies are being uprooted and completely destroyed to produce tar sands for oil. And they're arguing that they can only live off the land. If you destroy the land, you destroy the people, that they're completely interconnected. And this is very much goes along with the changes that Marx saw. And his concept of the metabolic rift, I think, is incredibly useful, because he saw humanity and nature existing in a metabolism. And capitalism produced a rift by driving people off the land. And as a consequence, the nutrients that people absorbed when they ate, instead of being returned to the soil in a healthy metabolism, would instead be dumped in the Thames and would pollute it. And then so instead you have to actually have this imperialism for guano all over the world to try and get the nutrients restored to the soil. Of course, that doesn't work. Then you have to have chemicals and fertilizers and so on. And it goes up all the way now to the tar sands, where the area size of Britain and Canada is completely beautiful forests and First Nation communities and cultures being completely ravaged, which then produces global warming, which now has produced historic floods. So I came from Toronto. Our city is was completely flooded as a consequence. And what's exciting, though, is that at these recent demonstrations now, they've been led by Indigenous communities. They've also had environmentalists, and they've also had the Canadian auto workers and workers of CEP, the union represented by the tar sand and the pipeline. So you can really see how the only way we can prevent climate catastrophe is by actually uniting the labor movement with the indigenous sovereignty movement, with the climate movement. And so the idea of dialectics and Marxist ecology are totally central for building these coalitions, for not only making the reforms of stopping the tar sands, but ultimately for having a revolution that's not only social and not only economic, but actually a full ecological revolution.
Thanks.
Thank you for the lecture. I think it's incredibly pertinent to a socialist revolution in terms of how the sex dialectic of nature might correlate to the sexual dialectics in society. I think the role of men and women being split into a binary composition of meaning has kind of funded the lack of awareness in people's psyches and rendered them culpable to many errors and mistakes. And I think to break metaphysics would require a dialectic of nature in terms of women actually leading revolution, because I think the fundamental problem that socialism has faced throughout in history has been the domination of patriarchy. And I think this is why your work that you're doing on the dialectics of nature could prove incredibly valuable. So in summary, I would say I would like to hear your view, Camilla, in terms of how the dialectic of nature would link to a sex dialectical understanding. Thank you.
Right. Pretty much, I would hope that Marxism brought people to veganism, but I came from the animal liberation sort of movement to Marxism via anarchism. I'm not saying that's the reason why I'm a Marxist. I'm just saying, there's material reasons why I'm a Marxist, not for that. But nevertheless, if you look at human nature, or how humans, when I say human nature, I mean how humans are developed depending on the environment, is an adaptation to the environment. So they adapt to the environment and think, do we move over here, or do we run our social structure differently and all the rest of it? And of course that's the development with nature that we have, the sort of, we are changed by it, and then we change it with our social construction, our social structure to deal with it. Now I think with veganism, it's not that pretty much that we'll have it under capitalism and people, all they have to do is read Marx and then become vegan. It's that actually, logically, if we had the control of the means of production, why would you waste so much land on animals when you could just grow the food and eat that, or make meat in a lab, if we develop that well enough. why would we enslave animals like cows and so forth to cause methane in the atmosphere that would cause climate problems with that as well? I mean, if we look at it logically, actually not using animals in these ways would actually be beneficial for us. But obviously the basic thing is that we need to have the control of meat production and a rational way of going through it. We can have these arguments after revolution, but I'll keep on doing it. I'll keep on arguing now, but I'm probably not going to win it until after. That's my bet anyway.
It's an interesting point about food, is that there's a whole argument around agriculture under a capitalist economy, and that maybe under a socialist economy we'd be able to rationalize production in a way that we could have, actual animals that are used for food as well as plants. But just further to what was said about the Idle No More movement, about I guess about 3 weeks ago, they had the First Nations community in the area in the tar sands in Alberta had what they call a healing walk, which was to walk through the area that's been damaged and to try to reconnect in some way the broken landscape. And what was interesting about that walk is one of the reporters for Rabble.ca, which is an online, all the stuff that doesn't get published in the regular press is put there. What one of the reporters said was, at least on that day, a third of the vehicles that were, honking their horns in support were vehicles that were going back to the workplace. They were the huge trucks that the workers were going back to work in. So there is a connection. The workers understand, if you work in the tar sands, you know that it's nasty. You know that it's destroying the environment, but you need to work. Some of these people don't have a choice. They have to go there or they starve. It's not quite my point, but I wanted to jump in with that. One of the things that I think I'm understanding from this, that I got out of it, was that this rise in this disconnect, this metabolic rift, started with the Industrial Revolution and the extreme urbanization of the land, where more and more people were taken out of the land and put into cities, disconnecting themselves from nature. To the point where we see it today. I have students coming up to me, 12-year-old students, asking me, "Miss, are carrots plants?" Not understanding that soup can come from somewhere other than a can. It can come, like, you can grow things in the ground, but no, the ground's dirty. I don't want to eat things that come from the ground. So what I think we're seeing is people unable to work and to understand what they don't know. And while we can have a dialectic, this idea of a dialectic and a way of understanding nature, if you don't know what nature is, you can apply all the theories and all the ways of thinking you want, but you can't actually do anything with it. So I think education of absolutely everyone and getting them back into nature is key to being able to explain, yes, there is a dialectic in nature and here's what it is.
I have no understanding of biology apart from what I've learned so far. That's it. So I went to a meeting on Dr. Anish Roberts and evolution in Bristol. I made a contribution saying, isn't the whole thing about evolutionary about the dialectical process between the relationship of an organism and its environment? The response was, that's very romantic, which I thought was a bit odd for someone who's got a doctorate in science and biology and stuff. And you think to yourself, we know about moths of the Industrial Revolution, which, according to their environment, the white ones were getting eaten because they could be seen in the dirt. So the black ones and the white ones sort of mixed it up, became grey, and they survived. And even the humble hedgehog, as we know and love today, who's finding it very difficult to survive on modern roads, curling up into a small ball, doesn't help you getting does help you getting crushed by live hills. So the plucky little things have decided that the ones with the longer legs can run quicker and get across the road quicker, and they've been surviving. So in our own lifetime, hedgehogs have got longer legs, and they've run across the road quicker. They don't try to curl up in the ball; they'll run. They learn that cars don't stop and don't care if you're in a ball. The other thing is like things that don't quite fit the categories of life. Wood lice, I love them. They're little things you find. It's a crab. It's a crustacean. Not in water. It's a crustacean. And you're thinking, how did that adapt to survive at the end? Oh, it's nice. Does it quite fit the paradox or the idea that it lives in water as a crustacean? And then you've got things like the horseshoe crab. It's not a crab, it's a spider. It's an acrid. How does an acrid live in water? Then you've got things that really, as we understand our nature, we've got things that really low down in things called the fumarole shrimps. Now, don't need sunlight. They live off the hydrogen around fumaroles in the bottom of the things. I think it's really important to understand all these different things is that actually really impacts us on a huge scale of understanding. Antibiotics are devastating to human life. They're not good, they just smack everything down. And those organisms we talk about evolve quickly. So you get superbugs. And you think we can't bother to actually make any more antibiotics because there's no money in it. But it doesn't matter about antibiotics. There's other things we could use, which is bacteriophages, which is nature's own way we can pull around to go and smack bacteria down. And you think, well, okay, what's that? So, GM plants. If you start engineering super crops, what are you going to get if evolution takes place? Super bugs that would be like so hard to kill, you're back to square one anyway. So we won against GM crops and understanding that evolution is a process, a relationship with its environment, and it will change to fit that environment.
Can you sum up, please?
Just such as the wood lice has lived on land and it's supposed to be a crab. Right?
I want to come back to the question of the dialectics of nature, because I think we've a lot of the discussion has been very interesting, but it's been primarily about metabolic rift and about ecology, which is one illustration of a dialectical process, but I don't think it's the central point of a discussion about dialectics of nature. I think that going back to the question that Camilla raised in her introduction when she talked about Lukács, and she said that essentially Lukács the question is, can you have a dialectic without consciousness? Is one way of putting it. In other words, when we talk about the class struggle, it's fairly obvious that what we're talking about is the process of material struggle at the same time as development of organisation, development of conscious intervention and collectivisation, the process of workers coming together to identify their own demands and transforming themselves in the process of that struggle. So that what you're doing is you're changing the world at two levels simultaneously. That you're changing both the material world and you're changing your ideas. Now, it's also possible to apply that process, and many people have done this, theorising about the history of science, to the history of science. So that, and the development of ideas, that you do the research and you affect material changes in the world and you change your ideas about your parameters, your frameworks and so on. Much more rich, by the way, a Marxist approach to the history of science than the kind of Popper kind of dead end, which just says, well, we just come up with theories, but nobody knows where they come from, and we just refute them. Yeah, I mean, the kind of anti-socialist response from people like Karl Popper, really not very sophisticated and relatively straightforward to dismiss. And there were far more people that you can read, Thomas Kuhn and so on, about the history and the revolutionary idea of scientific engagement. But I just wanted to focus on the question of, yes, can there be a dialectic of nature itself, within nature, without human intervention? Are natural processes themselves dialectical? Now, this question, I think, I would answer in the affirmative. And the reason I would do that is because many scientists have grappled with this problem and tried to use different frameworks in order to try to grapple with essentially the same problem. The problem in physics is called the three-body problem. It is where you have three bodies, more than two, right, in continuous interaction. That means that they are repelling or attracting each other, influencing each other continuously over a period of time. The problem is that all of the deterministic mathematics that people will use to study the process of change and movement of any one of those bodies, you hold one body as an origin, and you study the movement of the other one relative to it. But what about the third one? I mean, you can do the first with the simultaneous equations. The third one, then there's no single point of origin. And that leads to, just to go to this point, that leads to very interesting problems in the process of discovery, in all sorts of disciplines. But one example.
Can you sum up, please?
Let me give this one example because it's quite compelling. Is the discovery of planets. Pluto is a planet that was not discovered by direct observation. Much of what takes place in science is not direct observation, but indirect observation, inference on the basis of observations. In other words, it was discovered by perturbations in the orbits of other planets. And the reason that you have those perturbations is because Pluto is also a mass, just as the other planets are masses as well. You have a three-body problem.
Okay, Comrade.
So instead of the Neptune moving around the sun in a smooth and continuous orbit, it's interacting with Pluto as it comes past it. And it was that observation of watching what was happening to other planets, not the original planet, that allowed us to discover the existence of this additional planetoid.
Hi, I just wanted to talk about the way that people have been sort of describing evolution and adaptation. So with the hedgehog, hedgehogs have developed, well, they've got longer legs, but that's because of, they've been killed and they're the only ones that are left to reproduce, and that's sort of evolution in that kind of process. And just sort of bringing that into sort of antibiotics and bacteriophages, someone was saying that you can use bacteriophages instead of antibiotics. Bacteriophages is actually quite a new science, and that hasn't had enough investment into that research. And what I want to talk about science and how science is developed at the moment is that, for example, my degree was in tropical disease biology, and I get very frustrated because I can't actually get a job researching that because there is no money in that research, because things are driven by profit. People in poorer countries cannot afford those drugs in order to actually sort of get our research and development. So, for example, take malaria. The drugs for malaria, that you see the rise of drug resistance. And the reasons for that are that because the drugs are very hard to get hold of, or there's not enough of the drugs, there's not a sustainable sort of flow of drugs to the people that are getting them, is that you give, for example, if it's a 5-day course of antibiotics or malaria tablets or whatever, people, once they start getting better, they stop taking them. They don't take the full course. So once we talk about the death and evolution, you've killed off all the ones that are not very resistant to your drug, and then those that are left over, they then reproduce more, and that's where you get the resistance. So it's if you provided, so in the social society, you would be attending to need, and so you would have enough drugs and to sort of treat people, and they wouldn't be worrying about whether they've got enough the next time that they're ill. For example, with malnutrition, actually if you treated malnutrition, you would end almost half of child poverty around the world, and it's not just about the drugs as well. And the same with the development of GM food. Why are they developing GM foods when actually a third of the food that's produced is wasted? So you've got to look at that to sort of Marxist analysis of why science is developing in the way that it is.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, I don't think there's any particular reason why this meeting needs to be longer than all the other meetings at Marxism, so well, I will try and answer those questions. Though in any case, I'm not really equipped to talk about Adorno and Horkheimer and their specific position on animal rights. My instinct is that if you're reading Marx and you're looking between the lines, I think maybe there's enough written on the actual lines to be getting on with really without reading between the lines and starting to draw all kinds of conclusions. I mean, we've had lots of meetings at Marxism about Marx's views of ecology and what Marxists in the present day can take from that about ecology. And I think it's clear that there is sort of an ecological sensibility in Marx. Whether we'd all be vegans in the future, I think that's kind of up to the people of the future to decide that, and it'll be the changes that they go through if they hopefully reform society that will change the way that we live possibly. Nature does have a history. Organisms are capable of going through radical changes in the way that they live. So possible that some animals might go from eating meat to becoming vegan. But the point that radical biologists have also made is that there are also constraints on the way that organisms evolve. I think Gould and Eldridge's idea of punctuated equilibrium is the kind of the example of this, that it's not just like that organisms are free to evolve freely in any direction that they please, that there are also sharp twists and turns in the way that they evolve. They can stay the same for quite long periods of time and then suddenly go through a radical change in their form. There are constraints as well as freedom for organisms to change that might mean that they don't instantly all become vegan in the future. I think comrades are quite right to be angry that biology is driven by profit, that there are billions of pounds spent on Trident, not enough money spent on tropical medicine. I think it's disgusting, the priorities of the world that we live in at the moment. It's not just that the people that do that have that kind of knowledge can't get the job and can't use those knowledge, but it's also that existing scientists, there's also an impact on the way that existing scientists work, I think, from capitalism, that means that more dialectical approaches are potentially kind of held back. If you look at, for example, with GM crops, look at the way that scientists at the moment are trying to they say they're trying to optimize photosynthesis, trying to create a better kind of enzyme within the plant. But the only kind of sensible way you can do that is if you treat the enzyme as if it exists in isolation and can be analysed in isolation. When you try to make a better enzyme that you can sell on the market and make a big profit out of it, it doesn't really particularly help a lot of scientists to see the enzyme as in a historically evolving relationship with its environment or what have you, as part of a totality. But I think, as John points out, that practicing biologists are increasingly forced to take into account the complexities of the systems that they live in. Again, I'm coming back to biology. Comrades know much more about physics than me, and thanks for the example from physics. But biologists are being forced to acknowledge complexity. But nevertheless, I think there aren't huge amounts of dialectical biologists that I've spoken to. I've spoken to Stephen Rose and a couple of other people. All these people, in their day-to-day practice as biologists, they use reductionist ideas and they find reductionist ideas useful, but it's only when you get to interpreting those ideas and having a kind of an overarching framework of how the results of those experiments fit into the wider scheme of things that reductionism kind of reaches its limit, really. Reductionism, the idea that you can treat different aspects of the world in isolation and treat them separately. I think John Sinner's quite right to point out that scientists do have a philosophical framework. Engels called for, he was a philosopher and he knew a bit about science. Many other people within that tradition, unfortunately not enough people have also tried to re-engage philosophy and science with each other. Stephen Rose being one of them, that have tried to apply an explicitly Marxist, or at least left-wing philosophical approach to science. But I don't think any scientist is without philosophy. Engels said that if you don't acknowledge the philosophical basis of the science that you do, that you kind of have this, people might have heard the term physics, beware of metaphysics. If you avoid philosophy, that you end up doing philosophy anyway, but it's often the worst, crudest kind of philosophy. So, all scientists have some kind of philosophical background. People talked about reductionism, about the need for, you said that biologists and social scientists might need to understand biology, biologists might need to understand chemistry. I think that's right, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of the other kind of reductionism, which is seeing biology as reducible to chemistry, that there's nothing specific about biology, that it can all be explained by chemical formulas and that chemistry can all be explained by physics and physics by maths. This is the kind of, that's the approach that, what was the Human Genome Project guy, James Watson, what James Watson says when he says that there's only one science, physics, everything else is social work. I actually think that there is a difference. There is a difference with biology. There are questions that biologists would ask about the world that can't be answered just purely by physics. And people talked about that other kind of dialectics of nature, the dialectics of how how science has developed through time, which is a different question to whether there's a dialectic within the actual natural world. Yeah, lots of interesting things about hedgehogs. I knew the one about moths and pollution, because you get taught that one kind of every year if you do biology, and it gets a bit kind of repetitive, really. Liston Betrularia in the Manchester. But I don't know whether the one about hedgehogs having longer legs. I think that's really fascinating. And there's so many really kind of unusual things about biology. It's not just that there are crabs walking around on the streets with us. That we also share 98% of our genes with our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, but also that our bodies are not wholly human, that we actually contain large amount of all different kinds of organisms, that there are endogenous retroviruses within our DNA, that there's bacteria that lives in our stomach, and good bacteria, you might say, it's fungus, that we're really not kind of whole beings. I mean, but it still makes sense to refer to a human as a human, clearly, but it's not so easy to divide up the biological world into that's a human and that isn't, when you think about the way that the organisms are so intimately related to each other. Lukács and the idea of can you have a dialectic without consciousness, I think that's kind of key to it, the difference between Lukács and the people like Engels, the more naturalist Marxists. John Rees actually took in Algebra of Revolution a slightly nuanced position where he came to the idea that in Lukács you can actually see a dialectic in nature and also in society, but that's because the working class doesn't automatically have class consciousness. It's about how do we get class consciousness. So that there must be a point right now where there isn't the kind of consciousness that Lukács would like to see within society. But yeah, he still thinks that there are dialectical processes within society. So that's kind of John Rees's interpretation, at least, is that Lukács might have seen dialectics without consciousness, that consciousness isn't necessarily the deciding factor. And what we'd sort of end up on, I guess, would be the fantastic examples from Canada of the way that people have taken on environmental issues, and the way that trade unionists in particular have taken on environmental issues. I think there was a really inspiring campaign within Britain for 1 million climate jobs. Didn't start with the people that you would think it would start with. It started with Unite workers in Bistion in Northern Ireland and in Enfield in North London. When they went into occupation in their factories, because those factories are going to get closed down, these people were making car parts, but some of them started to have these little arguments about, we've got these skills that can make parts for cars, we can make anything in plastic, so why aren't we making recycling bins, or why aren't we making solar panels, why aren't we making something useful? I think when workers start to kind of question the idea of how they're using their labour and what kind of things they could be doing with their labour in a more democratic and a more rationally organised world, then that kind of points to how we might relate to the natural world in a more rational, in a more sane way, in some kind of future society, and how we might like to get to that world. Thanks.